On behalf of the European Institute at Columbia University, I want to welcome all of you to Columbia. It's a great privilege to have such a group of expertise here. In the last few weeks, especially as the semester started and the conference loomed, I practically wept at not being able to, this year, last year, read all of the important books and articles, some very recent, that this very distinguished group of scholars has published. And I'm only starting to become acquainted with the breadth and the scope of the work that's been done on the Congress. It's really seeing it has exposed a huge black hole in my own historical knowledge, and I trace this back to my graduate studies. I'm not going to blame Professor Woloch, with whom I studied, because I think what was happening then was that I approached the Congress of Vienna as an Italianist, a feminist, and a soi-disant revolutionary, and anti-Kissinger. And I was interested in everything anti-Congress, so Freemasons and Carbonari, Napoleon, and nascent nationalism and the 1821 revolutions. So one very important purpose here then is to acquaint you with the publications and how they speak to one another. We've got surveillance here, okay? Drones. To acquaint you, and all of us, with this extraordinary range of work, and that it's coming out of a transnational community of scholars, and is extraordinarily relevant both to rethinking the history of the Congress, but also, as we'll see, to discussions about our own times. So I want to welcome you here and to take the opportunity to thank the Austrian Cultural Forum and its director, Christian Moser, and its vice director, Christian Ebert, also the Heyman Center, which is a co-sponsor. The conference is taking place to mark the bicentenary. We want to, probe the nature of the Congress on a rather wide scale. We want to ask how the conference conveners conceived of the goals of such a meeting, how they manage its complexity, how they managed containing the forces that had been unleashed over the previous decades by the wars taking place not just in Europe, but also in Europe's global penumbra. We want to ask the mechanisms of collective security, the new ways of thinking about international values and norms, and new policing methods that the Congress devised to secure an enduring peace. And now, simply to undertake this endeavor, clearly we're thinking of marking the bicentenary, but that's not really enough to put together all of this. And I would want to call attention to three, if you want, more intimate considerations, local considerations on the part of the European Institute, on the part of my colleagues here at Columbia and the people we were talking to as we organized that. One is that Columbia itself has a very rich discussion around international history with our colleagues in political science and international relations. This is not always a simple conversation, as you might surmise, and so we wanted to enrich it and to move it forward, and this clearly was such an important subject, and it's not insignificant that in one of our colleagues is, Professor Jervis, and one of his students is here. So there's a long history of, if you want, of communication between history and the study of international relations. And so this conference is resting on that and wants to build further that conversation. On a more personal level, there was a stimulus of our undergraduate students, one in particular who was an intern, very deft brilliant cultural organizer, whose name is Julia Jarrett. At a certain point, she mentioned, en passant, that a certain Mark Jarrett, her father, who happened to be a graduate of Columbia University and apparently was in maybe my section when I TA'd for Fritz Stern, that he had just published a magnificent book, The Congress of Vienna and Its Legacy, War and Great Power Diplomacy After Napoleon. And contacting him, we were willing to host him solo for all of those qualities, having an extraordinary gifted daughter in art history, to be sure, the fact that he was a Columbia undergraduate and that he had done this extraordinary work. But he, in his great intellectual generosity, his brilliant garrulousness, pointed out that it was not only him at work, but a huge symphony, which was already playing at Harvard, Vienna, Strasbourg, Utrecht, and so on. And we had to assemble the best players, and that's what we've done. Okay. And often, when I just thought we'd finished and it was all set, I would get a call in California or wherever, and he had to renew my vocation for cultural organizing by spurring me on. So finally, there's a political point here that, nonstop war, perennial war, Cold War, global war on terrorism, when will we have a Congress? And so this question arises, what kind of Congress could we imagine that being? We're talking not with just with Mark Jarrett, but with others, including Joel Bell, who has been very engaged through his Schumer Foundation and who's here and whom you can want to talk to. Where's Joel? There he is. There he is. Imagining what would be a Congress today. I mean, what kinds of issues? What would the agenda be for peace? What would be the scope? Palestine, the Mideast, global climate change, gaping inequality. So these are the kinds of very broad questions that lie behind very serious, very deep, very wide-ranging historical research. I'm going to turn this over now to Gideon Rose, who will be chairing this panel. After this panel, we will have a big round table, and after that, a reception to which you're all cordially invited. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a real privilege and honor to be here after not getting a job as an academic. It's nice to be able to at least come in and moderate the talks of the people who did. This is not just the 200th anniversary of the Congress, as was just pointed out, but also a time when we're thinking about modes of international cooperation and conflict and looking for historical parallels. So it couldn't be a more timely event. And the Congress, as our panelists and others have written and we'll talk about, in many respects was a pioneering precursor to concepts that we think about today. It was not just a pioneering effort in global governance, but it pioneered what you might call the concept of responsibility not to protect. That was an IR joke, okay. Given the suppression of domestic responsibilities and rights, but didn't go over well. Okay, we'll move on. So it's been, this conference brings together historians and political scientists and others. It is not true, as someone once said, that historians know things and political scientists know how to think about things. Hopefully both know both. But the cross-fertilization, not just of history and political science, but of different kinds of scholarship and different aspects is, the Congress of Vienna is a kind of thing that has been dealt with by diplomatic historians in the past, but is now being addressed in a much broader spectrum of ways from scholars with much different disciplinary and intellectual interests and backgrounds and contemporary markers. And it's really going to be a fascinating conference to see what new perspectives we have on this that are different than those that would have been had at its centenary, when it was also a time of great renewed interest during the First World War, when people felt and talked about it as an immediate potential model for what might happen, not to mention in the past. We have a great panel today, and we'll get right to it. We have Brian Vick of Emory, Glenda Sluga of Sydney, Matt Rendall of Nottingham, and we have Bob Jervis and Isser Woloch of Columbia here as the discussants. I'm here kind of in no man's land, in the middle. Hopefully I won't get strung up on the barbed wire as the volleys go back and forth between the panelists and the discussants. But it will be an interesting discussion. And without further ado, let's get right to it. So why don't we just go in order, right to left. Brian, why don't you start off?
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you to the organizers for having us all together and inviting me to be part of it. At the time of the negotiations in Paris in 1919, the reputation of the Vienna Congress lay at a low ebb. Many actors, not least Wilson, thought of themselves as correcting the errors of Vienna. More recent commentators, comparing the Concert of Europe with what followed the First World War, have tended to be more favorable, above all for the relative restraint shown in the treatment of defeated France. But there is more to be said about the ways in which the Vienna settlement and the diplomatic innovations of 1815 helped define the relatively peaceful international relations of the 19th century. In thinking about the path or process by which European international relations developed from the Congress of Vienna to the Concert of Europe, one must begin with further consideration of the Vienna settlement itself. Such reconsideration can focus on the organization of diplomacy, but it also includes broader political culture and domestic institutions, as the version of realpolitik practiced by most statesmen was far from a classic primacy of foreign policy. In my book on the Congress of Vienna and political culture after Napoleon, I also emphasize the role of salon society, festive culture, the press, and the market in the praxis of European politics. Here, I underscore the role of constitutions as means to make territorial exchanges and regime changes more acceptable to local elites and populations. Hence, I highlight the role of both public opinion and political ideas. Those who emphasize the Vienna system's success tend to highlight the effort to look ahead and avert war, as opposed to the traditional role of peace conferences in bringing wars to an end. This is true to an extent, but it still needs to be recognized that the regime of collective security established at the Vienna Congress and after was as much about crisis management as about crisis prevention. Such an approach already represents a notable advance on the willingness to consider great power war as one of the first rather than last policy options, but the resulting security structures were not quite a European Security Council. Many of the examples often adduced of the workings of the Congress system or the later concert involved putting out fires already raging to stave off great power conflict. This includes the responses to the revolutionary outbreaks in Italy in the early 1820s and to the revolt in Greece and the revolution in Belgium later in the 1820s and 1830s. This is not to say that crisis prevention did not play a role. The system did include this function, particularly in the Congress phase from 1815 to 1822, but one should not stretch that too far. Crisis prevention came into play less in the Congresses than in the ambassadorial conferences designed to coordinate policy in very specific areas that might otherwise lead to friction. Most often cited is the ambassadorial conference in Paris, following the Second Peace of Paris. This regular gathering of the great power representatives to the French court was designed both to oversee Allied occupation policy after Waterloo and to serve as a clearinghouse for information on the political situation in the still unstable France, so soon after the second restoration of the Bourbon Louis XVIII. In line with the Quadruple Alliance, the ambassadorial conference kept a close eye on the hopefully sleeping French giant, but the venue also offered an opportunity for the great powers to work through their own disagreements and relationship difficulties, whether Britain and Russia helped shield France from Austrian and Prussian intransigence during the occupation, or whether Britain, Austria, and Prussia worked against too close a rapprochement between Russia and France. Metternich tried, unsuccessfully, to extend the group's surveillance duties to radicals in Brussels, and the Spanish and Russian ambassadors in Paris attempted to extend its reach even to the New World in order to arbitrate the dispute between Spain and Portugal-Brazil over the land north of the Rio de la Plata, here too without success owing to British resistance. Just as significant for future diplomatic intercourse were the less studied ambassadorial conferences in London, whose chief function was to oversee the efforts to enforce agreements to curtail the African slave trade and to negotiate final abolition. As envisioned in the talks in Vienna in February 1815, Castlereagh turned them a sort of permanent European Congress. He hoped to use the venue to put renewed pressure on Spain and Portugal to agree to full abolition, but he also thought the discussions could help avoid conflicts over measures to enforce abolition, such as the policing of international waters by Britain's Navy. Metternich agreed and stressed the utility of such meetings in avoiding misunderstandings. This was all very much in the spirit of preventative diplomacy behind the new Congress system. It was these ambassadorial conferences that proved the most institutionally significant moving forward in the phase of the actual concert of Europe from the mid-1820s. The distinguishing feature of the Congresses, from the Congress of Vienna to the Congress of Verona in 1822, was that they brought together both the leading diplomats and ministers and the rulers themselves, not to forget the rulers' entourages and the often rather large number of spectators, lobbyists, and hangers-on who converged on the Congress venues in order to see or profit from the show. These were, in other words, more like summit meetings. Following the Congress of Verona, these functions and groups were disaggregated. Monarchical meetings, with their pomp, circumstance, and PR opportunities, enjoyed a prominent place in European political culture from the 1830s all the way to the First World War, or indeed to the present if you read Head of State for Monarch. These partly public and partly offstage encounters probably did play an important part diplomatically in facilitating trust and understanding among governments, and domestically in feeding the public's taste for monarchy. The more involved diplomatic negotiations, though, tended to be treated in special conferences involving mid-level personnel. These gatherings had a lower profile than full-fledged congresses or monarchical meetings, but press coverage and public opinion could still play a role. To some extent, one can look back to the Congress of Vienna itself for the origins of such organizational forms. The Swiss Commission and the Statistical Commission to assess populations and territorial boundaries both consisted of mid-level diplomats knowledgeable in their respective areas who worked through difficult material under higher-level instruction to arrive at compromise solutions. The small commissions of Russian, Prussian, and Austrian delegates who drew up the final treaties for the Polish territories and the constitution for the new Duchy of Krakow also proved precursors for later developments, most obviously in the case of the London conferences in the late 1820s that drafted plans for Greek autonomy and independence, either within or outside the Ottoman Empire. In addition to the view that the Vienna system was primarily meant to prevent great power warfare, another school of thought emphasizes instead that the multilateral cooperation and the security regime was directed above all at the suppression of revolutionary or liberal movements. Both perspectives are partly correct. For that matter, the two approaches hang together, since most statesmen at the time believed that revolution formed one of the most likely sources of disruption and war. On this question, too, revisionist accounts of the Vienna Congress have tended to eschew characterizing the settlement as purely reactionary. Even here, though, I argue that we need to go still further and recognize the degree to which liberal constitutional ideas and respect for or fear of public opinion already entered into the thinking of the Vienna system's main architects. Though often overlooked, the years from 1814 to 1818 witnessed an unprecedented wave of constitutional proclamations. The constitutional charter pressed upon the returning Louis XVIII of France in 1814 and again in 1815 upon his first and second restorations is the most familiar and influential example, but it was one of many. The Netherlands also received a constitution, and when the Belgian provinces were added to it as part of the European settlement, the constitution was extended to the new areas with revisions after negotiations, including Belgian representatives and a guarantee from the powers. The first piece of the Vienna settlement, the cession of the former Republic of Genoa to the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, also involved constitutional protections for the notoriously reactionary king's new subjects. The Swiss Confederation received a new constitution, which guaranteed the existence of the new, more democratic cantons. And when Norway was assigned to the Swedish monarchy in 1814, the Norwegians secured the most robust parliamentary constitution of the period, which still forms the basis of the new Norwegian constitution. Even in the highest level, highest stakes diplomatic showdowns over the Polish and Saxon lands, the territorial settlements came with constitutional promises, duly publicized in proclamations. The promises were also fixed in treaties, and as already noted, the constitution of the new Duchy of Krakow was drafted by delegates of the three Eastern powers, assisted by the Polish nationalist Prince Czartoryski, and with later input from Krakowian representatives. Against this background, I argue that the shift toward a more conservative posture occurred over several years, leading up to and through the turning point of 1819 and the Carlsbad decrees, or the revolutions in Southern Europe at the start of the 1820s. It was not built into the settlement of 1814-1815. Preventing revolution was part of the security regime's aim, but the rulers and statesmen mostly agreed that this entailed avoiding both political extremes. Of course, they needed to keep an eye on radical movements, not least since they often believed the conspiracy theories about the origins of the French Revolution, or the conspirators' continued plotting after Napoleon's defeat. But they also appreciated, already at the Vienna Congress and long afterward, that too strong a counter-revolutionary reaction would itself provoke revolution. Hence, they also put pressure on restoration regimes not to be too repressive, and to respect some of the rights of the people, if not popular sovereignty as such. There was, in other words, a near consensus of the political middle, from moderate liberal to reform conservative, to avoid extremes that might spark revolution. The trend continued through the 1830s with recognition of Belgian independence as a constitutional monarchy and with the new constitutional Kingdom of Greece. This attention to constitutions also helps make a broader point, a final point, about peace settlements and post-war reconstruction that is sometimes overlooked. Reconstruction efforts at the end of modern wars involve not just economic and social reconstruction, but also political reconstruction, among other things, through constitutional settlements and amnesty agreements. This may be clearer in the revolutions and constitutional reforms and amendments following the First World War, or in the establishment of the German Grundgesetz and the French Fourth Republic, alongside the Marshall Plan, currency reform, and early thoughts of European coal and steel community after the Second. But the effort to satisfy war-weary populations with political concessions was just as notable a feature of the settlements that ended the wars against Napoleon, with its unprecedented tide of often internationally guaranteed constitutional proclamations. So, thank you.
Glenda.
I have a slide, so I'm going to get up. Just one. Here we are. Okay, so I'm going to start by thanking Professor de Grazia for organising today and tomorrow this extraordinary gathering of people around this question of the Congress of Vienna. And I am the only other historian on this panel, and I think sometimes that Brian and I think very alike on these questions. But I want to try and bridge a bit his paper and the next one in this talk, as you'll see. So why the history of the Congress of Vienna? My own interest in that history was piqued by its status as a transformational moment in the birth of modern international politics, when Europe shut off its cosmopolitan past and nationalism took centre stage. That's the general map. Both Brian and Paul Schroeder, amongst its two great scholars, have confirmed, respectively, that the Congress was characterised by a curious attention to publics, and it marked new practices of diplomacy, symptomatic and productive of the shift from aristocratic to bourgeois modes of European political life. More traditionally, accounts of the Congress have concentrated on its role in this is a quote, the most enduring European peace since the emergence of the modern nation-state system more than 150 years earlier, thanks to the balance of power on some counts or the concert of Europe on others. Or as the moment, indeed, that invited war by repressing national ambitions. As importantly, divergent interpretations of 1815 have been put to a wide range of political and historical uses. One of the most devastating examples comes from the lips of the historian President Woodrow Wilson addressing a joint session of the US Congress in February 1918 and casting the Vienna peace as the shreds and patches antithesis of his own vision for an international order based upon broad and universal principles of right and justice. In our own times, the global and international turns are pushing reconsiderations of peacemaking in 1815 and 1919 by taking heed of the world beyond Europe's borders. From this early 21st century view, we can't help but be disturbed, I think, by some of the centennial comments, such as those of the British historian Ramsay Muir, who assessed the concert's most remarkable achievement as he said, the quite peaceful, mutually agreed partition of Africa among the European powers at the 1885 Berlin Conference. In this paper and my contribution tomorrow, I want to make an argument for the Congress of Vienna as a significant site of international memory that deepens our understanding of the range of early 19th century conceptions of the international to the extent of not only confirming the modernity of the Congress, but also the ancienne qualities of international politics through the 20th century and in our own modern times. So this is by way of asking, too, why the history of the Congress still matters. So to the memory of the Congress, and I want to start with a letter tucked away, you can find it there, I promise, in the private papers of Lord Liverpool, the Prime Minister of England, and written to him by the British Foreign Minister Viscount Castlereagh in October 1818 from Aix-la-Chapelle, a few weeks after the signing of the agreement that concluded the first of the 4 congresses following on from Vienna between 1815 and 1822. So in this letter, Castlereagh recommends how much solid good grows out of these reunions, which sound so terrible at a distance. It really appears to me to be a new discovery in the science of European government, at once extinguishing the cobwebs with which diplomacy obscures the horizon, bringing the whole bearing of the system into its true light, and giving to the councils of the great powers the efficiency and almost the simplicity of a single state. In his public historical accounting, the Habsburg Chancellor Clemens Metternich described the Congress innovation more simply as the singular intimacy without example in the annals of history, in which chief personages in the great drama found themselves together in the very same place. And the most difficult affairs, he said, were negotiated from one room to another. No sending of couriers, no written negotiations, no medium between the courts. For Metternich, the regular conferences carried on with protocols were, in contrast with this singular intimacy, the public or notorious part, the official and confidential communications that added up to the facts stored in the archives. Until the day comes, they are picked up out of the dust. But they had little to do, these facts, these public meetings, had little to do with the motives and causes of events. Those were the preserve of the secret part of the Congress, the intimacy of negotiations between the courts. But I want to turn, in fact, to the protocols of those regular conferences that I think stand in the way of some of the ambassadorial conferences that Brian mentioned. These are the special committees that were indeed recorded. To be sure, the idea of the Congress was in itself not new. The historical memory of modern congressing takes us back to Westphalia and Rastatt at the least. However, until the 19th century, Congress was a term only Italian speakers might use, the French preferred assemblée, and peace agreements might be decided over the course of years, not months, and while battles continued to rage. What a leap, then, to 1814, when 10 separate committees were established to formally discuss the key issues. Brian's already mentioned the Statistical Committee, which I find extremely intriguing. There was also, of course, Germany, Switzerland, Tuscany, Sardinia and Genoa in one, the Duchy of Bouillon, which I also find intriguing, diplomatic precedents, the slave trade, free navigation of rivers and drafting. The spread of the committee's work tells us much about the ways in which national autonomy and universal federation impelled each other like two engaged gears. And that does require background music because it's from Friedrich Meinecke's impressive simile from his 1908 study, Cosmopolitanism and the National State. So he thought of it as national autonomy and universal federation impelling each other like two engaged gears. When we move our attention away from the territorial questions that were Meinecke's concern, we get a sense of the breadth of the universal aspirations, as he called them, of the cosmopolitanism of the period, including the economic motivations that ran through the Congress. So take, for example, the Navigation of Rivers Committee, gathered to establish as it was stated, the principles according in which the duties to be raised by the states bordering on the Rhine may be regulated in the mode the most impartial and the most favourable to the commerce of all nations. The further rationale for this endeavour was the facilitation of the communications between nations to render them less strangers to each other, to extend the Rhine's provisions to other rivers, which in their navigable course separate or traverse different states. For the committee's guiding presence, Wilhelm Humboldt, Prussian ambassador to the Habsburg court, the Congress offered an opportunity to invent institutions and structures that would complement principles so general, as he argued, that the free movement of commerce would not be affected by local diverse circumstances or by war. To these ends, Humboldt imagined a policing force and a centralising commission akin to diplomatic agents, negotiating complaints and acting in concert to reinforce the aims of the free navigation principles. The Slave Trade Committee directs us back to a Congress that was a decisive moment in the conceptual positioning of a European humanity alongside, as well as in opposition to, the sovereign interests and rights of states. Its dominant rhetoric went against the current of the commercial sense used to justify the navigation of rivers question. For Castlereagh, the slave trade was a commerce incompatible with the Christian religious principles of universal morality and humanity. And abolition was exemplary of the principles of natural and enlightened justice, which shape the times in which we live. Even Talleyrand picked up the rhetorical cue, adding that a similar declaration would be well received by the sane and enlightened public of all countries, and that it would bring honour to the Congress. Despite Metternich, these Congress committee debates are valuable sources for understanding the possibilities and limits of a science of European government, the importance of ideas and policies they impelled. The Slave Trade Committee eventually exploited the distance between general principles and local circumstances that Humboldt had sought to reconcile. Labrador and Palmela, the delegates of the major slave trading powers, Spain and Portugal, demanded a clause reserving to each government the liberty to determine the time at which the abolition of the slave trade could pass into law in their states without hurting interests that merited the greatest attention. That's the protocol recording it. Both Talleyrand and Castlereagh agreed that the clause allowed a suitable compromise between the wishes of humanity and the concerns of the interests and rights of independent powers. By the last meeting, Castlereagh concluded that they had been successful in setting a moral tone, while Metternich concurred that although the outcome was not relevant to countries without colonies, there was nothing foreign to them in regard to the importance of the good of humanity. Even Labrador's minority view that the Congress had not been formed to decide the legislation of nations or moral questions, and his claim that Castlereagh had more or less agreed that slavery was a question for each state, help us gauge the ideological expanse of the committee's majority decisions. Of course, by the time Castlereagh enthused over the discovery of reunions in the wake of Aix-la-Chapelle, we can see other ways in which congressing, as the means of arbitration between sovereign interests, may have appealed to him. We could note that at Paris and Vienna, Britain was able to exclude from the purview of European peacemaking its own maritime reach, its colonies, including the ongoing war with America, resolved in a separate but contemporaneous piece of the Kent negotiations. At Aix-la-Chapelle, similar imbalances of power were at play. Reunion had given the Tsar space to propose a new purpose for the European alliance, including the creation of a special association of states to enforce abolition in the face of continuing illegal slave trading. The Tsar, in continuous contact with the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, outlined a neutral administrative institution for the coast of Africa, as it was described, a maritime force, a judicial power, and a Supreme Council which would supervise the whole and report to the concert. For Castlereagh, the Tsar's plan was so novel and so complicated a system, as he described it, it was beyond any vision of the science of European government as he understood it. Ultimately, it was the Tsar who held out longest on behalf of the idea of a European government, particularly as he moved to the conservative end of the alliance spectrum, refusing even to advance Russian interests in the Crimea, for fear of testing the alliance and its moral and universal principles, at least until after the last of the congresses in Verona, and for anomalous reasons, as I will argue tomorrow. by way of introduction to tomorrow. So dusting off some of the facts of the public events of the Congress returns us to Paul Schroeder's 1990 post-Cold War inspired conclusions about the significance of its concepts and institutions, including its protagonist's recognition of the value of, this is Schroeder, intermediary bodies of concert and grouping methods, and international politics restrained by consensus and bounded by law. This also brings me back to the Congress of Vienna as a site of international memory, of the cosmopolitan and universalist imperatives, whether of free commerce or Christian morality, invoked by Humboldt, Castlereagh, the Tsar, and the impulse to arbitration and state-inspired rational thinking suggested by other committees, including statistics and the Duchy of Bouillon. The Congress exhibited as markedly the characteristics of political imbalance that shaped the modernity of international politics, and the gradual privileging of state sovereignty over individual sovereignty, a process captured by Emma Rothschild in her own post-Cold War 1990s article, What is Security? So why does this matter? Well, just quickly, the conceptual and institutional lines that connect the Congress with events 100 or 200 years later are more than crooked. They have been invariably broken and interrupted, even when they lead us back to the new science of European government or the possibilities of intimacy or even a peace of shreds and patches. Etienne François has argued that the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Empire belong nowadays to a chapter of the past that is closed and that has long since ceased to haunt the memory of European societies. But there may also be important lessons to be learnt from the historical recovery of the memory of the international dimensions of that past, as complex as they are, whether the presumptions of hierarchy and great power prerogatives, the desire to guarantee free trade, the conceptualisation of justice and rights, the controversies of international intervention, or the consolidation of the sovereign rights of states. The Congress system was also, ironically, an important moment in the cultural political marginalisation of Russia as oriental and out of place, even as the Tsar acted as a magnet for the most liberal principles of peacemaking long after the Holy Alliance interlude. I was reminded of this recently when Putin, of all people, publicly commemorated Tsar Alexander as one of the founders of a system of European security at the Congress of Vienna, when, as he's quoting him, conditions for the so-called balance were created, based not only on mutual respect for the interests of different countries, but also on moral values. As notable in that same discussion last year was Angela Merkel's own critique of Putin's disregard for a European system restrained by consensus and bounded by law, in which she relied on a global vision of international politics that had absolutely no resonance in the longue durée European past. She's forgotten about the Congress of Vienna. How the Tsar's particular investment in the international purpose of the mutual relations between sovereigns came about retains its mystery. Less mysterious are the value of reunions and the ambitions that inspired a concert of Europe when, as we are witnessing daily in the Crimea, both threaten to disappear. Thank you.
From Putin in Crimea to the old Crimea.
War. Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I was originally going to use my mobile to time my talk. That turned out to be a really bad idea, so I'm afraid to even turn it back on at this point. I'll rely on Gideon to tell me if I run over time.
It's okay. Dick Betts already humiliated himself
yeah.
after you.
It may seem a little odd to start a talk about the Vienna system and the Congress of Vienna with talking about the way the Vienna system ended. But I think it's important to understand how one got 40 years of peace, to consider how those 40 years of peace came to the end. And so I'm going to talk and put forward an argument today about the coming of the Crimean War. This is not based, I need to emphasize, upon detailed historical research. These are hypotheses I'm putting out here. I'm wondering about whether I should spend a couple of years of my life researching them. So I'll be interested to get your reactions to these questions. If you think I'm talking nonsense, please do tell me. Then maybe I can decide to go and write a book about something else. If, on the other hand, you think it's promising, please let me know that as well. Now, the puzzle I want to address here is, if when I asked anybody in 1815 whom Britain would have ended up fighting its next big war with, I'm sure the smart money in the Congress of Vienna would have been on France. And for about 40 years, it would seem that if they'd bet money on this, that it would have been a good bet. There were repeated militarized interstate disputes between Britain and the French in this period. Notably, between 1831 and 1844, we see them with disputes over Belgium, with disputes over the Near East, with disputes over Tahiti, all of which involve threats of force. There are no militarized interstate disputes of comparable severity between the Russians and the British. And yet the British never end up actually fighting the French, and they do, in 1853-54, end up fighting the Russians. Why? Now, you might think that this could be explained by traditional democratic peace theory. After all, as Brian has brought out, one of the big important changes of this period is the establishment of constitutional regime in France. And in fact, that is going to be a central part of my argument here. But the more traditional sorts of versions of democratic peace theory don't explain this very well. As Chris Lane has shown, we see Britain and France threatening each other in this period. They don't seem to show very much sort of respect for each other as fellow liberal regimes. In fact, my research on the Anglo-French crisis of 1840 indicates that they didn't even see themselves as belonging to the same kind of regime. And nor do sort of structural institutional constraints seem to explain the peace between these two countries the way democratic peace theory would lead us to predict. Rather, I'm going to invoke another sort of version, more recent version of democratic peace theory that I think does give us some traction here. Arguments that appeal to the transparency of liberal states. Now, it's widely believed, and Bob Jervis's work has been especially influential in this area, that states, even states that merely seek security, can come into conflict with each other because of the so-called security dilemma. Andrew Kidd has denied this, arguing that states that really seek security should be able to recognize each other reliably and not fall victim to the security dilemma. And he cites two mechanisms: the transparency of democratic states, but even if states aren't democracies, Kidd says, they can nevertheless signal the fact that they have status quo intentions through costly signaling. Now, I think the first point about democracies leaking information and showing that they, if they are peaceful, being able to demonstrate that they so is well taken. And costly signaling would also be a good way to signal one's status quo intentions if the leaders recognize that they need to do this. But in fact, again, as Bob's work has brought out, often leaders don't recognize the security dilemma. And what that means is that while peace among security-seeking democracies is what Enos Claude would call an automatic system, one that operates whether or not the agents actually recognize the need to do it, that costly signaling among security seekers is manual. It means that the policymakers actually have to recognize that they have to do this. Now, I believe, and I've argued, along with many other scholars, that the states of the Vienna system were essentially security seekers, even France. It's not that the French or other, for that matter, the Russians were completely satisfied with the status quo, but they weren't prepared to fight a major war against a peer competitor to try to change it. But while France had a liberal regime after 1815, and even more after the July Revolution of 1830, with a transparent foreign policy-making process, Russia remained an unvarnished autocracy. That means I'm hypothesizing, that the British should have had a roughly accurate view throughout this period of French capabilities and motivations. France couldn't help but signal its motivations because, as a liberal regime, it was constantly leaking information about this. Russian policymaking, on the other hand, remained opaque. Now, policymakers often fail to recognize the security dilemma, and I believe this was true of Russian policy in this period. Certainly my research on Russian policy in the 1830s suggests it. What I am hypothesizing here, then, is that Russian actions, above all in the Near East, were misperceived by British policymakers, especially Lord Palmerston, as highly expansionist. But Tsar Nicholas I failed to recognize this. So we see him saying to the French ambassador in 1838, "Who can think that I would want to conquer Constantinople or enlarge my territory? It is not in Russia's interest, and I have shown that it was not my inclination." And we see other statements by Nicholas of the same sort. I am hypothesizing, though I haven't yet done the detailed research, that we should see a similar dynamic of this, like this, operating in the run-up to the Crimean War. David Goldfrank, Susan Peterson, and V.M. Vinogradov have all suggested that Nicholas I in this period similarly failed to recognize his actions in the early 1850s in the Near East, how they could be interpreted as threatening in the run-up to that war. Now, I think what happened here is that Palmerston in particular, but also other influential people in Britain, drew the conclusion from the events from the 1820s through the 1830s that Russia was that had expansionist ambitions, and that it was necessary to cut them down to size before it was too late with a preventive war. And my evidence at this point that I have is largely from Jack Snyder's work, who's sitting in the audience here, that Palmerston believed in the importance of waging a preventive war against Russia before it was too late. He may have also had various domestic sorts of motives for going to war, as Jack's work has suggested. Problem is, though, whether he had sort of selfish domestic political motives for doing this, or whether he genuinely, as I also think was true, believed that Russia could become a threat, wars of this sort are hard to sell to domestic publics. As Randy Schweller has argued, democratic publics have short time horizons. They may be willing to launch wars against weak opponents that they can knock over easily, but to launch an expensive, costly sort of war on the chance that the country could someday become a big problem is not something democratic publics want to do. So if you want to sell a democratic public, or even a semi-democratic public of the sort that Britain had in this period, on going to war, and on a big, bloody, costly sort of war, you've got to either be able to present credible evidence that this country really is dangerous to them, or you've got to make it up. And if you want to do a preventive war, you're going to have to do a threat inflation campaign, as John Mearsheimer has recently pointed out. You're going to have to distort and sex up the evidence. We saw this in the run-up to the 2003 war against Iraq, and I'm suggesting that we also see this in the case of the Crimean War. Now, why did this end up happening against Russia and not against France? Well, partly because British policymakers genuinely misperceived Russian ambitions, but also because if you're going to sex up a case against a country for purposes of going to launching a preventive war, you can do this against autocracies, but it's very hard to do against democracies. It's hard to demonize a fellow democracy if you yourself are a democracy, because your public is likely to have too much information. The British public in this period had relatively good information about France. If you look at the newspapers from this period, the broadsheets, the British broadsheets reprint extensive translated news from the French newspapers, and the French newspapers do this with the British newspapers. So the attentive public that was reading newspapers and concerned with these things would have had a pretty good idea, I think, of what was going on in France. Efforts to depict King Louis Philippe of France as some sort of new Napoleon or Genghis Khan just wouldn't have come off. On the other hand, demonizing Russia was fairly easy. Autocracies are easy to demonize because their policymaking is opaque, and so it can be portrayed by motivated parties in the worst possible light. Moreover, there tends to be a bias among democratic publics to assume that dictators, tyrants, are aggressive. They aren't always. Military dictatorships, for instance, tend to be rather peaceful in general. But democratic publics have a tendency to interpret the policies of dictators as just fundamentally sort of aggressive. So Russia, this autocracy, filled the bill in both respects. Moreover, the British public knew little about it. People there spoke an exotic language that hardly anybody spoke. It was easy to engage in sort of orientalizing moves with Russia. So it was easy to trump up a scare campaign against it for the sake of a preventive war. Now, if these claims are correct, it suggests something interesting in terms of explaining the democratic peace. It suggests that there's a double barrier between war among democracies. Democracies often, though not always, are security seekers. In particular, they tend not to be security seekers vis-a-vis powerful other states. Democracies may be willing to attack other countries for expansionist reasons if they can knock them over easily. But launching a big bloody war against another state for expansionist purposes is not something that most democracies have historically, or in the present day, I think, wanted to do. Consequently, if democracy is going to get going, or war is going to get going among states, two democracies, they would have to misperceive each other. And as I've suggested, they are unlikely to do so because of democratic transparency. With autocracies, on the other hand, the transparency is not present, and consequently the security dilemma can operate. Moreover, supposing democratic leaders did want to launch a preventive war against another democracy, they're not going to be able to sell their publics at home on the need to do so, and they're not going to be able to distort the evidence in a way that would be necessary. Again, autocracies are easy targets in this sort of respect. And that means that we are unlikely, except in rare cases, to see wars among peer democracies, whereas we are likely to see this happen repeatedly between democracies and autocracies. Where does this end up with sort of conclusions for the Vienna settlement? Well, I think one of the greatest successes of the Vienna settlement, and one of the things that explains the long peace that followed, was the establishment of a liberal regime in France. And by the same token, I think one of the greatest setbacks of the post-Cold War era has got to have been the failure of democracy in Russia.
Thank you very much, Matt. So, Isser and Bob, you guys were there. Comments on our three papers?
All right, I'll go first only because I'm not going to give another paper, but on the other hand, I'm not really going to be an honest discussant of these papers, much of which I find persuasive, but frankly, I'm a bit out of my depth on much of that material. So instead, I would like to make what the French call an intervention, a contribution, which I've actually written out in order to just keep it very brief. My contribution would be to keep in view the problem of France, against which the Congress of Vienna initially defined itself, and which did not really come up very much in these three papers. Most obviously, the Allies faced the scourge of Napoleon Bonaparte, but implicitly at least, it was also facing the original sin of the French Revolution, whose legacies Bonaparte had sifted and who embraced in his fashion those that he allowed to endure. Above all, we ought to remember Bonaparte claimed to stand proof against the return of the Bourbons and their old regime. Now, the alliance of 1813 and its subsequent Congress of Vienna reacted decisively against two aspects of Napoleonic rule: the carnage of his ever-expanding resort to war, and the harsh negotiations or the unilateral treaties he imposed to conclude those wars when he prevailed. No amount of skepticism about the Allied powers can deny their achievement in bringing down the Napoleonic Empire and putting in place a sustained multilateral procedures to avoid or limit wars, or as Brian Vick put it, crisis management and crisis prevention. As Vick and Glenda Sluga both show, this extended beyond the big issues to a system of expert committees and periodic ambassadorial conferences to deal with some of the matters that they mentioned: boundary disputes, free navigation of European rivers, or suppression of the African slave trade on the high seas. But before the Congress of Vienna could be even a glimmer in anyone's eyes, the Allied diplomats first work to field substantial armies and to keep them going until they drove the imperial armies back into France, which I believe was their objective. When Napoleon rejected all various overtures to retain his throne within the France of 1792, the Allies then hung tough and crushed the imperial armies completely. Under the eyes of Talleyrand and Tsar Alexander, the infamously sycophantic Napoleonic Senate then did two things. It deposed the emperor outright along with his son and heir, and then, as requested by the Tsar, it drafted a constitution for the Bourbons that guaranteed individual rights and a form of representative government, which together arguably was the original intent, as I like to call it, of the French National Assembly of 1789-91. The Senate deviated from that formula, from that original intent of the French Revolution, with at least two provisions, one for popular approval of their constitution, and also for an hereditary upper house of peers that incorporated the Senate's own members. This blatant act of self-aggrandizement actually is what made it much easier for the Bourbons to scrap the entire document and famously to issue their own charter instead. Now, as Brian Vick observes, the Allied perspective, which was embodied on the scene in Paris by the Tsar, hoped to avoid the extremes of absolute monarchy or popular sovereignty in the restored governments, either of which might provoke new revolutions. Fair enough. But did the charter serve that purpose? Alexander had initially proclaimed that, quote, the Allies recognize and guarantee the constitution that the French nation shall give itself. Well, now this was not going to happen. The French nation was not in any way, shape, or form giving itself a constitution at this point. So one might pose the question, should the divine right prologue to the charter, which embodied the spirit of the new Bourbon regime, have been allowed to see the light of day? Or were the Allies simply following their intention of not interfering excessively with the internal affairs of a humble France? In any case, they did not question the Charter's preamble, nor its narrowly limited consultative institutions, its vague listing of individual rights, and the clearly insincere pledge that no individual shall be disturbed because of his previous opinions or votes. Now, it's fair to ask, was any consensus within the French political nation actually possible in 1814, apart from the temporary relief at the end of the war that most people did feel? If so, it might have been the notion of a Bourbon restoration without a counter-revolution. Constitutional royalists were probably put off by the exclusivist atmosphere around the court, where the most irreconcilable aristocratic opponents of the revolution and Napoleon finally returned to France and it seemed to be dominating. Relatively few Frenchmen wanted back the republic that Bonaparte had overthrown. The months that followed Louis XVIII's accession saw little regret over Napoleon's exile, except among aggrieved army cadres and nostalgic grognards. Few expected, let alone prepared for the emperor's return. But despite the restraint shown in some respects by the Restoration, there was growing dismay over the rigidity of the Catholic hierarchy and the tone of high society around the Bourbons. There was a great deal of resentment over the atmospherics, one might say, of the Bourbon regime that squelched all claims to French sacrifice, gloire, and prestige, along with France's expansion, at least to its natural frontiers. So without any polling to chart the probable sinking of the Bourbons' approval rating, we have only the cri de coeur of such figures as Lazare Carnot over how badly the Bourbons were serving France in their inability to reconcile with the revolutionaries or with the past glories of the French army. Now, I note here with qualified agreement Paul Schroeder's characteristically astringent comment that the Bourbon regime, quote, suffered from the political immaturity, illusions, and injured self-view of the political nation. But the regime failed to confront the problem, he says. He might have made it clearer that the Bourbons themselves suffered from these same deficiencies. In any case, the return of Napoleon raised more problems than it solved for France, but it galvanized the Allies into decisive action that overshadowed latent divisions within their own ranks. They agreed that there would be no negotiation with Bonaparte whatsoever. Now, Napoleon believed that major military victories would change that tune, but he was actually deluding himself, I think we would agree. One way or another, the Allies were going to prevail against him. Equally important, the Congress of Vienna was now convened and would not be diverted from its broader project of creating an international system, one, as Sluga summarizes, restrained by consensus and bounded by law, but also hierarchical. Well, obscured in all of this is one of the more interesting elements of the 100 Days. The referendum on Benjamin Constant's liberal additional act to the Constitution of the Empire. It's very challenging and difficult to interpret the vote by the French nation on this, on what, in other words, it wished to, quote, give itself at the moment. Now, the historical benchmarks for this include 1.8 million people turning out to vote in 1793 for the so-called Jacobin Constitution, around 3 million votes in 1802 for the life consulship, which, by the way, perhaps 1 million of which were fictitious or factitious, but that's another story, and over 3 million legitimate votes for the empire among an expanded electorate, territorially expanded in 1804. Those are some of the benchmarks of this process. It's not pure. Plebiscites were not purely Napoleonic, nor were they in the model of the original French Revolution. Okay, now, negative votes were never a problem in these plebiscites, but the abstention rate was always of concern to the government involved. In 1815, with around 5 million citizens theoretically eligible, 1.5 million turned out to vote, essentially, yes, on the additional act, with massive abstentions in the South and the West. Frederick Bluch, the historian of the 1815 plebiscite, believes that as perhaps 60% of the votes came from Republicans of one degree or sort or another who voted yes in an anti-Bourbon reflex. And it's interesting that 2/3 of the surviving regicides took the trouble to do so. He surmises that some liberals simply refused to vote for this Napoleonic enabling act, and that many local notables and bourgeois moderates who had once supported the Napoleonic settlement now sat on their hands. In other words, in the plebiscite of the 100 Days, Frenchmen could affirm the Restoration simply by not voting, or they could reject the Bourbons, but only by voting for liberal principles wrapped in Napoleonic imperial pretensions. They had no chance to vote on a liberal constitutional monarchy headed by the Bourbons, whether or not the Bourbons would have agreed to that. So this leaves me with one question to ask my colleagues, panelists, and other experts in the audience who know the sources of the Congress of Vienna, as I do not. Do the sources show any Allied protagonists reacting in any way to this ambiguous vote in France? I would be very interested to hear any kind of response to this query. In any case, the Allied victory in 1815 left the Bourbons even more resistant to any truck with the French Revolution's legacy. Symbolically, all the books explain this, they insisted on the white cocarde, flag in a sense, rather than the tricolor, which you might remember, the tricolor was fashioned in 1789 precisely by melding the white standard of the Bourbons with the red and blue of Paris, but this would not work for the Bourbons. Their vindictiveness against the so-called lapsed regicides implicated in the 100 Days deserves a passing mention, even if it was probably far exceeded by what happened in Spain under Ferdinand, and perhaps in some corners of Italy, as Mr. Davis might be able to comment on it. In sum, then, the Congress of Vienna stood admirably against the hyper-nationalism and militarism that was perhaps spawned by the French Revolution, but taken to ludicrous extremes of tyranny and carnage by Napoleon. But having thereby demolished the Napoleonic settlement in France, the Allies would not or could not help France very much in coming to terms with the aspirational legacies of the French Revolution or the profound divisions that they had caused.
Thank you very much, Isser. You get another clap for that. Bob, you get to tie everything together.
Yeah. Well, like Isser, I'm not going to go paper by paper, but unlike him, I don't have quite as organized a theme. I'm going to hit on 5 or 6 general points that I have come up that I think we may come back to over the next day and a half. One is sort of the changes in memory and evaluation that the Congress of Vienna looks much better after 200 years than after 100 years. Whereas it's come back from the grave looking rather nice. And it's interesting to think about the changes over time of the evaluation of it, and similarly, of course, the Woodrow Wilson quote brings up changing evaluations of the Congress of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles, rather. And it would be interesting, I simply don't know this, to look at the period from 1815 to 1914 and the rise and fall of evaluation of the settlement. I suspect that the thing that brought it most into discrediting was, of course, the 1914 itself. Not only the fact of another great war, but that it lasted so long. But, obviously a full-scale comparison of the two endings and structures that were evaluated is far beyond what I could do. But it strikes me that, again, thinking of the Wilson statement, that in part that the Vienna settlement worked better because it wasn't as ambitious as Versailles. That after World War I, for Wilson, he really did want, in a way, a revolution. Wanted totally to change the way international politics was done. Some of the French leaders wanted to change it too, but only by keeping Germany under their thumb. The rest of the rules of the game were fine. The Bolsheviks, of course, also wanted a total change, but in a different way. Whereas, although the changes were very significant in 1815, they were, I think, perhaps more historically grounded, more realistic. Their reach didn't exceed their grasp by as much. Okay, that leads to the second question or subject. And this is, how deep were the changes embodied in the settlement? This is something several of us have debated and like the rest of the panel, I have great admiration for Paul Schrader. I've worked with Paul. I, in fact, convinced him, how many years ago, to publish in places where political scientists would read, because I thought his work was so marvelous. Paul has not entirely forgiven me for that, but I am very grateful for myself and for my discipline for that, because I think his work is so stimulating. As you know, Paul sees the changes really going very deep. He sees this way as re-socializing the leaders, the elite, and to some extent, although he talks about this less, I think, even the strata in populace that really mattered. The position I've developed, I don't want to go into in detail here, I'd gladly send you to the articles I've written about it, sees a significant change in that the actors come to, as we put it, value the system in itself and want to preserve these arrangements, but nevertheless to be more limited than Paul sees it. Well, they change some of the rules of the game, but it is somewhat the same game, whereas Paul sees it, I think, in a real sense, as a very different game that they're playing. Others, Matt, I think, somewhat, Karina Kagan, some others, see even less of a deep change, see the main thing as the national interests. It isn't so much the national perspectives on broad rules of cooperating as it is most of the players are fairly satisfied. Not complete, but they're fairly satisfied with what they've gotten. And so that is the reduction. So I think one issue that comes up very hard is sort of how deeply were the people, and not only the leaders, but at least a couple of them, how much were they changed by the searing experience of the war and the fear of revolution, which we are tightly linked to the feeling of never again. And we can't afford to play a game in a way that would lead to such a war. Another very interesting thing on the changes in the depth, and this comes up in some of the papers, and something I hadn't fully appreciated, is the role of all the subsidiary groups, the ambassadorial conferences that go on this later, and the committee structure, which I think is really quite innovative. And that, on the other terms, I think just opens up all sorts of channels for different groups to get a sense of what the others are thinking, to increase the transparency that I talked about, and that's a way of increasing depth. Okay, just two more. One other question of what's driving this. How important are the individuals and the personal relations? These are related but a little different. I mean, to tell the story here, there are we know the classic leaders who are very powerful, and they are, I don't think in any way sort of typical, if you will, of the diplomats who preceded them. Tsar Alexander, especially, those of you I know, Matt is a very strange character, right? I mean, it really, maybe the word unique is overdone, but right, not many like him. The others, too, are very, very strong personalities, and as we see from the shift from Castlereagh to Canning, you take some of these people off the picture. They got hit, by a carriage crossing the street. How different would the history have been? I think people would say, that's a parlor game. No, I don't think it is, because it goes to what are the driving causal mechanisms here. And related is how important were the personal relations they had with each other. I think they're really quite important, and that may be, I think historians take that for granted. Political scientists don't now. They used to deal in personalities, but now in current political science, that's somehow considered verboten. And personal relations, I mean, I'm struck, I know the academic literature on negotiating and bargaining in political science, nothing about personal relations. I've talked, and probably Gideon even more, and good friend. I've talked to a fair number of American negotiators dealing with very nasty countries and difficult problems. Every one of them talks about after the first 5 minutes is going to bring up the importance of the personal relations among them. It's a really striking difference, and I think it is come up here. Finally, in terms of how they managed this and how the group succeeded as well as it did, I think part of what the tension here, that partly works and partly doesn't, is what I call the scope. What are they trying to regulate? What problems are they trying to solve? Where does each country have a legitimate say in various other international issues and in issues in other countries? And I think, both the papers touched on this, and I think in very interesting ways. Britain, and Paul also would stress this very much, Britain succeeded in excluding a lot of the issues that most concerned it. Very clever. And part of the game, I think, was bargaining over what was in and what was out, what was legitimate topics for discussion, bargaining, negotiation, and what wasn't. The slavery question is I hadn't fully read, a very interesting one about how do you get it halfway, they end up halfway in, halfway out. That's what they're talking about. What do we collectively, can we legitimately discuss and not on issues ourselves? The other one is, and very important, is Gideon's joke, which deserves more appreciation. That is that to what extent was there a collective concern for what we would now call human rights considerations in other countries? And this was important partly because, as all the papers mention, the concern for revolution was really central to what's going on here. The links between revolution and war seen as inextricable, and the question of how infectious is revolution. There's a disagreement where the Brits feel a little more immune, but everyone agrees. And maybe this is not like measles, but it spreads. And they, of course, don't entirely agree on how to deal with the potential, how much, if you will, the rights to give. What are the ideal aspects of what political science would talk about, state-society relations? And I think the point's made that this is not entirely a reactionary move, and the sponsorship of the constitutions, I think, which I've not been fully sensitive to, I think is a particular part of this. But the continuing difficulty, which obviously you see in the subsequent 2 centuries, but I don't think this is presentism to read this as an important element back because we're aware of it now. This problem of how do these states decide what is in the purview of their collective judgments and how much is reserved, if not for each sovereign, but how much is reserved for each sovereign state. I think is central to this, and the papers and the literature draws on, I think, just reinforces how important this period of history is, both for considering lessons, which I guess the next panel will do, we may come back to, but at least as much as just a fascinating period of experimenting in history, an attempt to deal with pressing problems that succeeds in some ways and fails in others. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it's actually, I can't believe I'm saying this given my own background, but I agree with what Bob just said, and it makes one realize that, at least for someone like me, a traditional realist type, it's a little bit odd, that there really is a huge scope for the constructivist role in studying these kinds of issues, not just because the construction of the international, the construction of what is what you just were talking about would be a fantastic research project for why they even thought they could cover these things and not those things, and how the view evolved. It's not just a site of historical memory, it's the site of the construction of the international. And this was a great panel. It's a great kickoff to what will be a spectacular conference. I hope there are no Americanists here, because it would shock them too much to deal with a Congress that was actually functional. As we segue into the cocktail hour, Bob was talking about the role of individuals at the conference. We shouldn't forget that. Of course, one of the most distinctive was Talleyrand, and my own favorite quote from surrounding the Congress was his response back to his sovereign, who was trying to give him some instructions at one point. Talleyrand employed the greatest chef of his day, Carême, and he supposedly responded to Louis, Sire, who was trying to give him some directions. Sire, I need saucepans more than instructions. Let me do my work and count on Carême.